Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us in the evening hours for those of you from the United States. I'm Satoshi MACHIDORI. I'm professor of political science, and my research focus on the comparative politics, including the United States. And I belong to the Kyoto University, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Today's host organization, the Japan Institute for International Affairs, titles this webinar, the condition of American democracy and its impact on US foreign policy. I think this title contains enough information that there is no need to add more, but I will say a little bit about the purpose of the webinar. American democracy has long been considered a world leader, both in idea and in practice. Despite the many challenges it faces, today, however, there are indications that democracy in the United States is in a state of flux. The term division or polarization has become used as a matter of course for the widening of socioeconomic disparities and or the deepening of conflicts over race and religion that tied together. It is not uncommon to point out that the political development from the election of Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election to the present day have reinforced the negative effects of polarization. What should we make of this situation? Can the US once again solidify its position as a democratic leader? What implications does this have for the current international situation in which Russia, China, and other authoritarian regimes are focused? In this webinar, we hope to have a lively exchanges of views of these things. Before we begin, I would like to introduce today's speakers. I'm sure all of you who are attending today are familiar with them. So to save time, I will stop a brief introduction. First of all, here is today's presenter, Ambassador Ira Shapiro. He is a former ambassador at the USTR during the Clinton administration and currently the president of the Ira Shapiro Global Strategy LLC. He has just published a book on the US Senate in the polarized era. Ambassador Shapiro will give us about 10 minutes talk. We have two more discussants. The first person is Ambassador Kenichiro SASAE. He is a former ambassador to the US and currently the president of the Japan Institute for International Affairs. The next discussant is Mr. Glen FUKUSHIMA. He has a major member of US-Japan relations for years and currently a senior fellow at the Center of American Progress. Each of Ambassador SASAE and Mr. FUKUSHIMA is expected to give 5-minute comments. After these great talks, we will go into more interactive phase. Ambassador Shapiro will reply to comments from Ambassador SASAE and Mr. FUKUSHIMA. Then, if we have enough time, we will have Q&A sessions dealing with questions from audience with speakers' replies. Since today's webinar has a great number of audience, please submit your questions not by raising your hands, but through Q&A function of the Zoom. I apologize in advance for not being able to address all the questions. So we have arrived at the starting point. Ambassador Shapiro, please begin your presentation.
Thank you, Professor Machidori. And thank you, my good friend, Ambassador SASAE, for allowing the Japan Institute of International Affairs to host this webinar. And delighted to be joined by my friend Glen FUKUSHIMA. I do a lot of speaking around the country because of my recent book, but I have found that the condition of American democracy is a grave concern to many countries. So I've spoken to Australia, to Canada, now to Japan, and also to the European Union. America is has the longest standing democracy in the world and is the leader of the democratic world. And so the precarious condition of our democracy has to be of great concern to many of our friends around the world. I come at this as someone who has written 3 books about the US Senate and essentially charted the decline of the Senate, which closely parallels what I believe to be the decline of American government and politics. Not identical, but closely parallels it. And I want to say first, because we all of us in the United States and around the world focus a great deal on former President Trump. He's had a large impact. He continues to have a large and detrimental impact. But American politics and government were not in good shape before Donald Trump. I remember coming to Japan many times between 2012 and 2016. And I would always say to my friends, and that was during the Abe years, Ambassador SASAE was our ambassador, your ambassador in Washington. And I would say to my friends in Japan, it's wonderful to visit a country that has a functioning government, because we actually didn't. We had a paralyzed government. Our president, Obama, who was elected twice, could not carry forth his program in large measure because of obstruction by the Senate. We had partisanship and we had gridlock, and that was before Donald Trump. And then, of course, that opened the door, in my view, to Donald Trump's election and everything that happened afterward. Because of my focus on the Senate, basically, I view this as a situation where, while Trump, in my view, was a disaster for our country with continuing consequences, the failure of government has been the United States Senate. The Senate is supposed to be our nation's mediator, in Walter Mondale's famous phrase. The Senate has a particular responsibility. We have a strong Senate because they're supposed to be able to hold accountable and check a rogue president. If we have a president who overreaches, the Senate is supposed to be the institution to deal with that. That was what the framers had in mind. That's what happened in 50 years ago during our crisis with Richard Nixon. The Senate played a key role in forcing Nixon's resignation. What we saw this time, however, was the Senate, weakened by its long decline into partisanship and gridlock, was incapable of dealing with Donald Trump. There was a brief period when I was optimistic that some of the Senate Republican senators understood the challenge that Trump posed, and that they were going to hold him accountable. But then a few senators who were most concerned about Trump, either retired or, in John McCain's case, passed away. And the rest of the Republicans increasingly acquiesced in the Trump presidency. And even as it became clear that we had an unhinged president during the pandemic, who was signaling clearly his intention not to accept the results of an election, the Republican Senate did nothing about it. Now, it's not entirely fair to say they did nothing. They focused on a few things that they cared about, and particularly capturing our Supreme Court. And again, the Senate is supposed to be a moderating influence. It's at the center, it's sort of at the fulcrum of the government. It has the president nominate Supreme Court justices, the Senate has to confirm them. In this case, the president nominated a series of extremists, and the Senate not only confirmed them, but confirmed them through a corrupted process. that put in place extremist justices, but also a bitterness about the way it was done, a lack of confidence in the court, and this court has not hesitated to behave in a lawless fashion, which has further eroded our situation in terms of our democracy. So, sorry. One of my views is that it often comes up, I'm asked, isn't this just the division between the parties? Shouldn't, what could be expected when the parties are so far apart, regionally, racially, ideologically? And it is true that they're very far apart. But from my standpoint, that makes it incumbent on senators to bring people together and to bridge over those differences, particularly Senate leaders. And a Japanese audience is quite familiar with some of our great senators who I grew up working with. Ambassador Mike Mansfield, Ambassador Walter Mondale, later Vice President, Ambassador Howard Baker. Three of the great senators who specialized in bringing people together. And they would not, those three people would not have stood by for years of gridlock, nor would they have stood by for Donald Trump's assault on our democracy. So the failure of the government is essentially what I wrote about. When I, as a former trade negotiator, when President Trump was elected, people said to me, you must be concerned about his trade policy. And I said, I think it's the least terrible thing about it. There are far worse things, and we've seen far worse things. Now, from a Japanese standpoint of a Japanese audience, the question is, what is the future of American democracy? Is this situation going to get better, or is it going to continue to be a threat? And also, how will it affect our ability to conduct foreign policy? I'm going to leave most of that for our discussion, but I want to say that we have seen some promising signs. President Biden has brought a normalization to the White House and has also worked very hard to reestablish our alliances that were hurt, but particularly our alliance in Europe and with NATO. I think our alliance in the Pacific under the Trump years held up somewhat better than the European alliance, because Trump basically would have taken us out of NATO if he could have. But I think we are by no means out of the woods yet. The fate of our democracy, I think, hangs on the results of the 2022 elections and the next presidential election. And as people who study the news from Japan know, the degree to which Donald Trump's big lie has taken hold, that people believe that the election, still believe the last election was stolen, has really become a cancer on our politics. So I'll leave, because we have time, want to have time for discussion, I'll stop at that point. My concern has always been that no one person should be able to destabilize our government. And yet, because of our weakened guardrails, that's exactly what has happened. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shapiro. Actually, your English is reader and listener friendly in mainly for Japanese audience. Thank you very much. And your talk is very insightful and stimulating. And so we already have some questions, but we need to these questions later. And just before that, we'd like to go to discussants. And first of all, Ambassador SASAE, and please begin your comment.
Well, thank you very much, MACHIDORI sensei, and also good to see my old friends, Ira and Glen. And first of all, about Ira's presentation on the American political debate and the role of the Senate, and also the impact on the friends and so forth. I mostly agree when it comes to how you would assess the situation. But let me just talk more from the Japanese perspective on the American politics. One, I think in spite of the President Biden's declaration after he took the office as a president, he said that he would like to recover the unity of the nation and called for healing the divide and so forth. Now, after more than a year, and it's continued to be difficult, and it's not, of course, the Trumpism, all of this, movement continue to be there. But I think after some period of time, it became clear that the Trump influence continued to be there. So recently, we see the President Biden is shifting its political stance more toward the fighting mode, and he's talking about Trump as a destroyer of American democracy and neo-fascism movement and so forth. Is this because of Biden's confidence on the status of U.S. economy and all this legislative achievements and so forth, including inflation and so forth? Or it's more of the concern about the current status in the future? And this could be mixed. I don't know. I'd like to hear views from our American friend. This is the first point. Now, on the second point is that the role of the Senate is also a big problem. I agree, but at the same time, for example, Leader McConnell seemed to be a bit away from Trumpian positions. Is that because that he's worried about the future of the Republican Party, or he's still looking at the situation where a majority of Republican candidates are still depend upon the MAGA or Trumpian movement? For that, I'm not quite sure, but my perspective is they are there. They will continue to be there. If the president is President Trump will be indicted or weakened in the coming months and even year time frame, these movement, where do they go? I mean, are they going to be cooling down, or are they going to more extremist positions, or going to the violent mood? That's a disaster of American democracy. That's my concern. Now, on the leadership of American, body politics in the world, I agree that there is a much concern that the divided world, if the America's democracies continue to be divided inside, could it be legitimate enough to exercise the leadership both globally and regionally? And I agree with Ayla that President Biden is doing good to continue to build up the relationship with the NATO allies and Asia Pacific ally like Japan and Korea and so forth, and even supporting Taiwan for the democracy in the region. But to us, for example, the Americans' interest, the general public interest, is not necessarily American role, global and regional terms. It's more concerned about day-to-day life and including their economic life and social life. So would the current government, the Biden administration, could convince the American public that America still need to be exercise of leadership together with friend and ally? Is that continue to be a good banner for President Biden to lead the forthcoming election, including midterm election? On the midterm elections, I don't know, to be honest. I'd like to hear more from Ayla and Glen's view. But before there was concern that Democrat will be defeated in the lot in the lower house, and in the upper house, I mean in the Senate, it might even lose. But there is a more view recently. I hear that Democrat could sustain and even be better. And for that, how that would make an impact on the presidential elections. And we are, of course, interested in that. But the question is that there is less support for Mr. Trump to run for the president and less support for Joe Biden to run for the president 2 years from now. If that is the case, what are the candidates on the horizon, credible candidates on the horizon? I don't know. Possibly our American friend could tell more. I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sasai. And the 3 points are all significant. And we will deal with these points later. And next, we have another discussant, Mr. Fukushima, and please tell your comment.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Machidori, and thank you to Ken Sasai and JIIA for hosting this event. And also, it's a great pleasure to be with Ken Sasai and my good friend Ira Shapiro and Professor Machidori. In the limited time I have, in my opening comments, I'd like to make 3 points and then end with a question for Ira. The first point is that when we talk about and discuss this issue of American democracy and its influence on foreign policy, although Ira, because he spent a lot of time in the Senate, justifiably focuses a lot on the role of the Senate and the Congress, but in the short term, it's clear that the president himself or herself has a significant impact on American foreign policy. And we could just see from the fact that President Trump basically by himself withdrew the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear accord, withdrew the United States from Paris Climate Accord, and a number of things on immigration that restricted immigration, which in many cases the courts in the United States blocked his efforts. But still, I think the role of the president, constitutionally speaking, it's clear that the Congress has a tremendous role, and especially when one thinks about war powers and about sustained support for something like, for instance, Ukraine. And without the support of the Congress and the funding that's provided for military and other aid for Ukraine, the U.S. certainly wouldn't be, on the president alone, would not be able to sustain the support for Ukraine. But clearly, the role of the president is so important that I think we do need to spend some time on the president himself or herself and his or her role in foreign policy. And then the second point I'd make is that turning to the Congress, clearly there are many people in the United States and probably abroad who are looking at the midterms, and as Ken Sasai mentioned, there's been considerable turmoil just within the last couple of months with regard to events that would influence the outcome of those elections, because inflation's gone down a bit, gasoline prices have gone down, a number of the bills have passed the Senate and the Congress, including the CHIPS Act, as well as inflation reduction, including gun control, and others, including climate change and holding the price on prescription drugs. So there are a number of achievements that the Democrats have been able to accomplish. And so I think, and in addition, the rather big, huge issue has to do with Roe versus Wade. and the impact that that may have on the elections. And certainly when one looks at District 19 in New York, where Democrat won, who focused on the abortion issue, or Kansas, which is a very conservative state, but voted in favor of keeping abortion legal. And looking at Alaska, the recent election there, I mean, there are indications that there are some changes underway, but it's really hard to measure to what extent that's going to impact the outcome. But I think there are basically four scenarios. Number one, that the Republicans win the House, the Democrats keep the Senate. And if the Republicans take the House, I think it's probable that the Republicans will make it very difficult for the Biden administration to pass legislation. And probably the Republicans will institute all kinds of investigations, whether it's about Hunter Biden or even perhaps an impeachment proceeding against the president. So certainly that would pose some huge problems for the administration. Another scenario is that the House would stay Democratic, but the Senate would go Republican, which is a less likely scenario. But that certainly will make it very difficult for the president to get his nominees confirmed, whether it's for the Supreme Court or for cabinet officials or federal judges and ambassadors. The third scenario is that the House and Senate both go Republican, in which case it'll make it very difficult for the Biden administration on policy issues, getting bills passed in the Congress, getting people confirmed. And then the fourth scenario is that the Democrats hold on to both the House and the Senate, in which case actually the Democrats may actually be able to get a lot accomplished in the next 2 years. So we can have very different outcomes depending on what happens in the midterm. So it's very important in that case, in that sense, not only domestically, but internationally. Then the third point I'd make is that since Ken Sasai touched upon 2024, and we can talk more about this in the future, this is an election which I think is very difficult for anybody to predict at this point, in large part because a lot depends on whether President Biden runs or not. A lot depends on whether Trump runs or not. And every day there are new factors that just today, the court, the complaint, civil action, New York, will probably prove to the detriment of former President Trump. To what extent, we don't know yet. So last time around, there were 28, altogether there were 28 candidates on the Democratic side. This time, I don't think there will be as many, but if President Biden decides not to run, there will be lots of candidates. And so it's quite unpredictable. The final thing is I'd like to ask a question of Ira Shapiro, and that is that I think it's pretty clear that for the next few years, we're going to see division, polarization, hyperpartisanism, and so forth. I am personally, in the middle and longer term, more optimistic that things will become much less partisan. And I base that on three things. Number one is demographics in the United States. I think by about 2045, the US is going to become majority minority. And I think most of the public opinion polls show that the non-white population are more likely to, compared to the white population, more likely to favor policies that are less divisive than what we see now. Number two, when I look at the millennials, people in their 20s, you look at all the public opinion polls, and you find that whether it's on climate change, abortion, gun control, trade, the whole range of issues, I think there's a pretty clear trend among the younger generation, which I think will trend toward a more open and tolerant society and a less divisive society. And number three, and this is very personal, I'm from California. I grew up in California. California has been the bellwether state for the United States, kind of running about 25 or 30 years ahead of the rest of the country in many respects, politically, socially, culturally. When I look at California, which until 1992 was solidly Republican, but from 92 on has become increasingly Democratic and increasingly at the forefront of issues like climate change, immigration, gun control, abortion, gay rights, and so forth. I see that as a positive trend personally. And so in the medium and long term, I'm relatively optimistic that these divisions will be overcome. So I'm curious to know what how Ira sees this in the kind of medium and longer term beyond the short term. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Fukushima. And now we'd like to go to the phase at which Ambassador Shapiro will reply to comments from Ambassador SASAE and Mr. Fukushima. And so please go to your reply, Ambassador Shapiro.
First, combining the comments of Mr. Fukushima and Ambassador SASAE, there's no question that the presidency is powerful. It's supposed to be powerful, and it's gotten more powerful since World War II. And it matters who is president. So Donald Trump was able to destabilize our country and the world to a large extent because he was president. Joe Biden came to office with a commitment to restoring normal politics. And I believe that was a very sincere commitment. He's a good faith political player. He wanted to bring people together. He has some skills and experience in doing that. And he has, on occasion, succeeded in doing that legislatively. But at the same time, he has not been able to overcome the polarization and the growing tendency of the Republican Party to not only be extreme, but to sort of embrace and support those who advocate violence. So because President Biden ran for office and said, I'm running because this is about the soul of America, he has tried to heal it. He has tried to bring people together. But when it didn't work, he feels the need to speak out against the threats to our democracy. And I think that that's a reasonable approach. Number two, I think it's with respect to Senator McConnell, who I put at the center of all things bad, the Republican leader, he does disagree with Donald Trump, and Trump criticizes him constantly. McConnell would desperately like Trump to wither away and fade from the scene, but that hasn't been the case yet. McConnell stays in power because the Republican donor base believes in him, and he delivers for the Republican donor base legislative and regulatory policies that they like, massive deregulation, and the judges, the right-wing judges that they like. He will stay in power as long as he can, and he has their support. He will not be in power if the Democrats can actually hold the Senate, and perhaps if they gain a couple of seats, I think it might be time that McConnell fades from the scene. But he's tenacious and he will hang on. With respect, I want to add one thing. One wild card, I believe, is that the angry, divided, terrible mood in the country reflects a lot of things, and certainly inflation is one of them now. But COVID has had a profound effect on everything. And it's at least possible that as we return to normal life, and we are returning to normal life, COVID's still an issue, but normal life is returning. I think that things could start to feel better in the United States, think a little bit. With respect to Mr. Fukushima's wonderful question, I share his view about the medium to long term. I do share his view. I don't think the younger people would put up with the kind of divisions that we've had. I don't think they'd put up with the gridlock we've had. I love their concern about everything from climate change to inequality and other issues. I think the next few years can be very turbulent. precisely because of what Glenn said, we are moving toward a minority-majority situation where there will no longer be a white majority in the country. And that is the thing that has caused a great deal of the backlash in the Republican Party. So the people that are upset about what has been happening in the country, the MAGA Republicans, are likely to remain upset for the foreseeable future. So I'm confident the younger people can take care of our future if we can hold it together until then.
Okay, thank you very much. And before going into the Q&A session, does Ambassador Sasai or does Mr. Fukushima, do you have any reply to the comments? Or I don't know. Oh, yes, Ambassador Sasai, please.
Thank you, Ira. Let me say a few words on what you say. I agree with the role of U.S. president. In most of the countries, a leader makes a lot of difference on the foreign policy front, apart from general public interest in daily lives and issues. But still, I think there is this issues of how you could spend the time on domestic issues and foreign policy issues. I think for the moment, President Biden is doing good, making its own presence felt and doing better with the friends and all. I hope that he will continue to do so. And on the role of McConnell and Senate, I don't know, to be honest, that if Republican would lose the majority in the Senate, and the McConnell's position could be difficult. I will agree, but it doesn't mean that all these, MAGA supporters or those who think that they were alienated or isolated and not treated well, and those people, continue to be there unless government could seriously address, or the Congress and the Senate could address how you could save these people. I mean, it's difficult, and it's easy to say in the longer run there is a demography and the younger generation who are more democratic, hopefully from your own perspective, but it doesn't mean that nearly less than half of the populations are still on the other side, and especially those people who are not saved. You need to save from democratic side, and I think that's the fundamental issues, not simply 2 or 3 years issues. It's longer term issue. I just wanted to say.
Mr. Fukushima, do you have any questions or replies?
Well, yeah, one thing I wanted to mention is that the future of the Republican Party is clearly something that's a major factor here, because on the Democratic side, although there are many different and diverse views, as Democrats often have had, the Republican Party is really split between the pro-Trump and anti-Trump people, as we could see from Liz Cheney and her role in the January 6th committee. So one issue has to do with Trump himself. And clearly, it's hard to predict about Trump himself because of the court case in New York, the court case in Georgia, the Mar-a-Lago, confiscation of documents that's happened, the January 6th committee report that's going to come out, and showing how anti-democratic and how much he was trying to undertake a coup d'etat in the United States, and the potential other actions that the FBI or the Justice Department may take. So one question has to do with Trump himself and what role he's going to play in the future of the Republican Party. But then another issue is even if Trump himself becomes disqualified or unable to run to be president, then there are others in the Republican Party who have adopted a lot of his policies and his approach. And so, I mean, probably the most famous person is Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who is a very smart person. He's a lawyer, unlike Trump. He's also spent time in the Congress as a member of the House of Representatives. He knows Washington. And in many ways, I mean, he could, if he becomes president, do much more than Trump did, precisely because he knows Washington and he's been governor. So there, on the Republican side, it really is quite well, interesting, but also hard to predict. And clearly on the Democratic side, I think in terms of people, it's hard to predict. But in terms of policy, I think it's kind of, in a sense, it's Democratic Party is more predictable in many ways, I think, than the Republican Party, which is so split. So let me conclude there.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ambassador Shapiro, do you have any reply to these comments?
Well, I don't see the I mean, there are differences of view in the Republican Party, but what Congresswoman Liz Cheney found out was that when she got beaten so badly, even in her own state, the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party, the MAGA, Make America Great Again wing, is dominant at the moment. And as Glenn says, it's possible to believe that Trump will have too many legal problems that could impair him from ever being president again. But it's very hard to see how anyone in the Republican Party gets nominated who is not something of a Trumpist, as DeSantis is. I think there are people floating around, and we were talking about Maryland Governor Hogan, who's a moderate Republican, who might see a path to the presidency. I think what he's looking at is imaginary. There is no path. And I think that the Republican Party will not reconstitute itself as a mainstream conservative party unless this iteration of the party is smashed, basically. They have to be defeated. And it's not that easy to defeat them because we are such a divided country. All of our elections have a tendency to be quite close. But until they're defeated decisively, I'm afraid the Trump influence on the party and the Trumpist views will continue to predominate in that party.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we'd like to go to the Q&A session. And just before opening the questions from the audience, I'd like to ask just one question with the privilege as a moderator. So I agree with Mr. Fukushima and the point that the future generation is more tolerant, and we can take more optimistic view. But at the same time, at the current situation, the socioeconomic disparity or socioeconomic instability has a great effect on the American politics. So how can U.S. political leaders convince that their commitment to international order is consistent with the socioeconomic stability in the near future? So so actually, Ambassador Shapiro refers to some great senators, such as the Mike Mansfield and Howard Baker. However, the current situation is different from the 1980s or early 1990s. So because the socioeconomic disparities has so enlarged today. So in this situation, how do political leaders make people believe the commitment to international order is more effective for their economic stabilities? So this is my question.
Well,
Well,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Well, I was going to say that if one looks at the area of trade, which Ira knows very well, it seems to me that the main reason there was such opposition in the United States, in certain parts of the United States, to TPP was the view that if the US entered into this kind of arrangement, that this would destroy American companies and destroy American jobs, and it would be detrimental to the United States. That was the argument that Donald Trump was making. That's the argument that Bernie Sanders was making. Now, Donald Trump was accusing the foreigners of this. Bernie Sanders was more accusing the American billionaires of this. But in any case, so in my view, what American political leaders need to do, and this is something that I think they can learn from Japan and Europe, is to try to provide a better safety net in the United States. Only by having a safety net in the United States, where workers can be not assured, but at least their opposition to things like trade agreements can be moderated if they do a much better job of this. And I think American political leaders, and I think it's difficult to get Republicans on board because they think the role of government should not be to provide safety net. But I mean, you know, I was talking about how the pandemic influenced things, but the massive amount of money that was used during the pandemic actually did a lot of good in terms of reducing childhood poverty and, you know, income disparities. I mean, it was a short-term measure, but I think the US, so to answer your question, I think that the American political leaders need to have a much stronger commitment to creating safety net so that the benefits of trade agreements can be derived and try to minimize the negative disruptions from trade agreements.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, Ambassador Shapiro, please.
Well, I completely agree with Mr. Fukushima's point. I think that, and I'm a former NAFTA negotiator, and I think that all of us who ever believed in that type of trade agreement believed in certain other policies that would be a safety net, that would be retraining, that would be essentially focused on regions that needed the help. You know, you can't judge, well, we have in the United States, prior to Biden, we had become the most unequal society you can imagine, and in advanced societies. We know that globalization and technology everywhere produces inequality, but it's the job of government to lean against that, to put in place policies that actually redress those inequalities or at least reduce them. And what Glenn has said, which is very important, some of our COVID policies and Biden's other efforts have actually done that. We've begun to reduce childhood poverty significantly. We've begun to reduce inequality. When Intel makes semiconductor fabs, a new fab in Ohio, as opposed to abroad or in California or New Mexico, that's an important thing. Investments have to be made. We're a big country and investments have to be made everywhere. And of course, we welcome Japanese companies and others to invest. But the point, one of my points of my book is that a long history of Republican obstruction to every democratic policy initiative is one of the reasons that we haven't stepped up to any of these problems. And so it may be a complicated argument, but if the Republicans oppose everything and the voters look and say, nothing's been done for us, then they get angry at the government, which they should.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now we'd like to go into the questions more directly related to the international order. So I have some questions. So one is that the international order is now being damaged by cases such as China's cohesive actions in the wake of its rise and Russia's aggressions in Ukraine. So how will the polarization of the United States respond to these situations? So do you have any replies to this question?
I guess I would say briefly that the challenge posed by Russia in Ukraine has actually produced an encouraging response in the United States. It has brought together the political parties in support of strong support of Ukraine, major weapon sales, etc. There is no real division in the United States, frankly, about China. Both the Democrats and the Republicans believe that China is no longer regarded just as a competitor, but it's more, regrettably, as an adversary. I wish we had spent some time keeping them in the competitor category, but that's not a partisan issue. We're less divided on foreign policy, but the danger here is that if we have a divided country and elections that swing back and forth and elections that are contested, it will erode America's ability to lead and to do anything.
Okay. So other replies? So Mr. Fukushima, how do you think about this question? Oh, he's on. Okay, maybe some troubles happened. And so I'd like to go to another question related to the China problem. Actually, as Ambassador Shapiro refers just before now, the United States is said to be bipartisan when it comes to its policy to China. But can this be regarded as a trend that we continue as a political polarization twice? What is the U.S. vision for the future of the Indo-Pacific region? Can continue bipartisanship? Okay.
I think the United States hurt ourselves with our rejection of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's a credit to Japan that Japan stepped in to provide leadership for all the other nations. It was harmful because that was our competitive alternative to China. And we hurt ourselves, and that was unfortunate. But I do think that the Biden administration is trying, through its Indo-Pacific economic framework, to show our allies that we do care about the region. But I think that, we're always going to be overextended if we are focused on Ukraine, focused on the Middle East. We always talk about pivoting to Asia, but we have worldwide commitments. I think Japan has done an admirable job of living in a very tough neighborhood. I admire how Japan has managed to handle the situation with China, to maintain so many economic relationships, but without compromising its stand on the Senkaku Islands, etc. So foreign policy will never be easy, but we're focused on stopping Russia at the moment and competing with China.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to go another question related to the historical thing. One question is comes to where or to whom do you the question to Ambassador Shapiro, where or to whom do you attribute to the cause or state of the current dysfunction of the Senate? would you praise the start of the current polarization and dysfunction with a new to Gingrich? How do you think history will view Mitch McConnell, who has led the Senate or led the opposition in recent years?
Well, I want to help how history will view Mitch McConnell, which is why I wrote the last book. I think it's important. McConnell has exercised more power than any Senate leader, and it's been a very destructive legacy. I do think, as this questioner indicated, that the long decline of Congress and the long movement of the Republican Party started with Newt Gingrich.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone seems to agree on that, and I think it's right.
Mm-hmm.
But McConnell has had, as 16 years as Senate leader, if you look at when things really turned in our government and politics, Mitch McConnell is at the center of most of it.
Thank you very much. And I think this will be the final question we can deal with. It's related to the 2024 presidential election, and the question says, aren't both Biden and Trump too old to run in 2024? Is there really anyone to replace them in the two major parties, especially among Democrats? So they are too old. Really? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think it's true that there are many polls that indicate that younger Democrats very much want to have a younger candidate and not President Trump to run, President Biden to run. But, I mean, the reality is that, age is very specific to individuals. So there are some individuals who, I mean, Speaker Pelosi is 82 years old, right? And but as a general matter, I think it's the case that both the Republican and Democratic Party, I mean, the preference would be to have a younger person, especially on the Democratic side, I think, because Democrats generally want to have new people and want to have a younger generation. But, and the thing is that's interesting is that probably until about a month or two ago, the trend was against Biden running because his approval was so low. But part of the reason his approval was so low was because the perception was that he wasn't getting things done, and inflation was high, gasoline prices were high, and that bills were not getting through. But now that bills have gotten through, and there is gun control, there is, the CHIPS Act, there's inflation reduction, and gasoline prices have gone down. So right now is a period where, many Democrats are thinking, well, actually, we've accomplished a lot of things that we thought we were going to do. And I think probably Biden himself is thinking that, gee, maybe I do have support now to run. So I mean, I was talking with some people just yesterday and today who thought that he probably would want to run again. But I mean, I don't know. I think Ira knows the president better than I do. So, but it's very unclear at this point, I think, whether Biden would run. I think in the case of Trump, I mean, for him, age is not a factor at all. I mean, he'll do what he want to do, and regardless of what his age is. But the age factor is important in a general sense, but specifically with regard to Trump, I think it will not change his mind. And in the case of Biden, I think that the situation is so much in flux right now that I don't think for him, age is such a factor. I do think for many Democrats it is.
Okay, thank you very much. And if we have a younger generation president in 2024, or actually 2025, will it have any effect on the U.S. foreign policy?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that question, Professor. Can you say it again?
Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, if U.S. have the younger generation president in 2024, will it have any effects on the U.S. foreign policy?
Oh, I think so. I mean, look, if we have Trump as president, it will be shockingly disruptive again.
Mhm.
If we have someone like Trump, who has not been president but is equally ignorant, it will be a disaster. The Democratic, I mean, I agree that Biden has a difficult decision to make because he could say, well, I'm doing pretty well now, and I'm the only person who can beat Trump.
Okay.
But he could also say, I'm doing pretty well now, and I regarded myself as a transitional president,
Mhm.
and I can't guarantee that I'll be doing well for the next 6 years at my age. So he might decide not to run. But I think that the essence of our problem in the next few years, before the moderate to long term, when things get better, is the extremism of the Republican Party, the threat it poses to our democracy. And whoever is elected in the Senate and in the presidency, it better be Democrats.
Okay, thank
You're muted. You're muted.
You are muted, Machidori Sensei.
I'm so sorry. Our limited time has already run out, and I would like to conclude today's meeting with some brief closing remarks. First of all, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the three speakers, Ambassador Shapiro, Ambassador SASAE, and Mr. FUKUSHIMA. All of them made harsh comments about current US politics because of the seriousness and gravity of the issue itself. And I think it was very meaningful that they were able to address the issue head-on today. I would also like to thank those in the audience who asked some questions about US foreign policy and domestic policies. I regret we cannot cover all of them due to time constraints, but thanks to you, we are able to open up new perspectives for the future. I personally believe that the US has the biggest beneficiary of the international cooperation and globalization, and that the challenge for the future is how to build the circuit that links the benefits of the US on the macro level to the micro socioeconomic benefits of individual citizens, and that the same things applies to other major countries, including Japan. There were many inadequacies due to the moderator's hearing ability, but I hope that everyone who attended today's meeting benefited from it. I also thank staffs at the JIIA, Ms. Naoko Funatsu and Ms. Yayo Ihara for their great efforts to set up this webinar. And have a great day and night. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you soon.
See you.
どうもありがとうございました、町鳥先生。